The sound of falling books shattered the silence of the Fort Benning Military Library. "I said, step aside!" Captain Blaine Mercer shoved the small woman away from the bookshelf, sending her stumbling backward until her shoulder collided with the wall. Hazel Thornton, 50 years old with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, limping slightly on her left leg, did not utter a single word. She simply bent down, picked up the fallen book, and smoothed out the crumpled pages with careful fingers. "Listen here, bookworm." Lieutenant Ivory Stanton crossed her arms, a contemptuous smile spreading across her perfectly made-up face. "We're conducting a high-level security inspection. Your job is to make coffee and keep quiet. Understood?" 32 people in the library witnessed that scene. Not one of them spoke up. Hazel nodded, her eyes cast downward. But in that fraction of a second, her gaze swept across the room, registering the position of every security camera, every emergency exit, every face. An old habit, a reflex that 20 years could not erase. "Move it!" Sergeant First Class Brick Callahan barked from across the room. "Get me the Section Delta classification files, right now!" Hazel limped toward the archive storage room. No one noticed how she precisely avoided the camera's blind spot. No one saw how her fingers glided across the encryption keypad with the speed of someone who had done this thousands of times before. And certainly, no one in that room knew that in 20 minutes, 3 Interpol jets would land on the runway, carrying an international special task force with only one demand: take us to the architect. And when the truth was revealed, everything they thought they knew about this invisible woman would collapse completely. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Hazel disappeared into the archive room, her slight frame swallowed by rows of metal shelving that stretched toward the ceiling like silent sentinels. The smell of old paper and institutional cleaning products filled the air, a scent she had grown accustomed to over the past 5 years. 5 years of being overlooked, 5 years of watching, 5 years of waiting. She found the Section Delta files exactly where they should have been, except they were not there. Someone had moved them. Her fingers traced the empty space on the shelf, and a muscle in her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She already knew who had done it. Fletcher Dunn, the civilian contractor with the expensive watch and the permanent smirk, had been playing these games for months, hiding files, misplacing documents, creating small inconveniences designed to make her look incompetent. What he did not realize was that every petty act of sabotage told her something about him, about his access, about his patterns, about his true purpose at Fort Benning. Hazel moved 3 shelves to the left, reached behind a stack of outdated training manuals from 1992, and pulled out the Section Delta files. 30 seconds. That was all it took to find what someone had tried to hide. When she emerged from the archive room, Fletcher Dunn was standing near the reference desk, pretending to examine a logistics report while watching her from the corner of his eye. His jaw dropped slightly when he saw the files in her hands. "How did you—" he started, then caught himself. He forced a laugh that sounded like gravel scraping against glass. "Lucky guess, I suppose. Even a broken clock is right twice a day." Hazel said nothing. She simply placed the files on the desk where Sergeant Callahan was waiting, her movements measured and precise. "Took you long enough," Callahan muttered without looking up. "My grandmother could have found them faster, and she has been dead for 15 years. A few nearby soldiers snickered. Private First Class Clover Reyes, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, shot Hazel an apologetic look from behind the circulation desk. But, like everyone else, she remained silent. In the military hierarchy, a civilian librarian ranked somewhere between furniture and background noise. The morning continued its brutal rhythm. Colonel Silas Crawford arrived at 0900 hours, his silver eagles gleaming under the artificial light. He was a tall man with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the desert for a few decades. His eyes swept the room with the practiced efficiency of a commanding officer conducting a threat assessment. When his gaze passed over Hazel, it did not pause. She was part of the scenery, no different from the potted plant in the corner or the faded recruitment posters on the wall. "Status report," Crawford demanded, addressing Captain Mercer. "Security sweep is in progress, sir. We have received intelligence suggesting potential compromise of classified materials within the base. The library has been flagged as a possible point of interest due to its archive access." Crawford nodded, his expression unchanging. "And what have you found?" "Nothing conclusive yet, sir. The civilian staff has been cooperating. Mercer's tone made the word civilian sound like something unpleasant he had stepped in. Hazel continued her work, restocking a cart of returned materials. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, but her ears caught every word. Potential compromise. Intelligence suggesting. They were looking for a leak, and they were looking in all the wrong places. She placed a thick volume on military cryptography back on its designated shelf. As she did, her fingers automatically aligned the spine with its neighbors, creating a perfectly even line. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but Master Sergeant Raymond Oakes noticed. He had entered the library 5 minutes earlier, ostensibly to retrieve a technical manual on communications equipment. But his eyes kept drifting toward the silver-haired librarian with the slight limp. There was something familiar about her, something in the way she carried herself, something in the economy of her movements that spoke of training most civilians never received. Raymond was 63 years old, with 38 years of service behind him and more classified operations in his memory than he could ever discuss. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were screaming at him. He watched as Hazel reached for a book on the top shelf, her body stretching upward with a fluidity that seemed impossible for a woman who walked with a limp. For just a moment, her stance shifted. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced on the balls of her feet, ready. Then the moment passed, and she was just a librarian again. Slow, ordinary, invisible. Raymond picked up his manual and headed for the door, but not before catching her eye. Just for a second. Just long enough to see something flicker in those gray depths. Recognition? Warning? He could not be sure. At the circulation desk, Lieutenant Ivory Stanton was holding court. She had gathered a small audience of junior officers and enlisted personnel, all eager to bask in her attention. Ivory was what military culture sometimes produced in its worst moments. Competent enough to advance, connected enough to be protected, and cruel enough to enjoy both. "Did you see her face when Blaine pushed her?" Ivory was saying, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "I thought she was going to cry. Honestly, I do not understand why they keep these people around. A computer could do her job better." The group laughed obligingly. Specialist Logan Pruitt, a young IT technician with freckles and an earnest expression, laughed too, though his eyes darted toward Hazel with something that might have been guilt. "You know what I heard?" Ivory continued, clearly enjoying her audience. "She used to work at some small-town library in Kansas before this. Probably got this job because she knew someone who knew someone. That is how these civilian contracts work. Maybe she is secretly a spy," one of the junior officers joked. "Like in those movies, the quiet ones are always the dangerous ones." The group erupted in laughter again. Ivory wiped a tear from her eye, careful not to smudge her mascara. "Oh yes, I am sure the CIA is desperately recruiting librarians from Kansas. Quick, someone call Langley." Throughout it all, Hazel continued her work. She did not flinch, she did not react. She simply filed documents, organized shelves, and performed the 1,000 small tasks that kept the library functioning. But those who were watching closely, and there were a few, might have noticed that her hands never trembled, her breathing never quickened. Her expression remained as serene as still water. That kind of emotional control was not something you learned in library school. If you're fascinated by stories of hidden heroes and secret identities, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that notification bell. We upload incredible military stories every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. The journey of the architect is just beginning, and the secrets she's hiding go deeper than anyone in that library could possibly imagine. Subscribe now and join our community of over 2 million viewers. The clock on the wall showed 10:30 when Captain Blaine Mercer decided to escalate his campaign of petty cruelty. "You there," he called out, snapping his fingers in Hazel's direction as if summoning a dog. "We need these files transported to Conference Room C on the 3rd floor. All of them." He gestured toward a stack of document boxes that must have weighed 50 pounds combined. The library had an elevator, of course, but Conference Room C was deliberately chosen because it required navigating a long corridor and 2 flights of stairs that the elevator did not service. Clover Reyes stepped forward. "Sir, I can help with that. It is a lot for one person to—" "Did I ask for your input, Private?" Mercer's voice cracked like a whip. "Return to your duties. The librarian can handle her own responsibilities. Unless she cannot, in which case we should discuss whether this position needs to be reconsidered. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Hazel looked at the boxes, then at Mercer, then at the boxes again. Without a word, she lifted the first one, adjusting her grip to distribute the weight evenly across her frame. Her left leg, the one that caused her limp, should have buckled under the strain. It did not. She made 3 trips up those stairs, carrying loads that would have challenged soldiers half her age. By the time she finished, she should have been red-faced and gasping for breath. Instead, she stood in conference room C, barely winded, arranging the documents on the table with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. Corporal Dahlia Marsh, Captain Mercer's assistant, had been sent to verify the delivery. She found herself staring at the older woman with something approaching confusion. "That was fast," Dahlia said slowly. "Are you not tired?" Hazel smiled, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. "I have good days and bad days. Today is a good day." It was a lie, of course. There was no such thing as good days and bad days when you had spent 18 months crawling through jungle terrain with 60 pounds of equipment on your back. There was only mission and recovery. Everything else was manageable. Dahlia continued to stare, her brow furrowed. Something did not add up about this woman. The limp suggested physical limitation, but what she had just witnessed suggested anything but. Before she could pursue the thought further, her radio crackled with a summons back to the main floor. The morning bled into afternoon, and the security sweep continued its methodical progression through the library's systems. Sergeant First Class Britt Callahan had taken personal charge of examining the archive access logs, convinced that if there was a security breach, it would be found in the paper trail. "Thornton," he called out, pronouncing her name like it was a particularly unpleasant medical condition. "Get over here." Hazel approached the workstation where Callahan was hunched over a computer monitor, his massive frame making the ergonomic chair look like dollhouse furniture. He had earned his nickname Tank, honestly, with shoulders that seemed to stretch on forever and hands that could probably crush a basketball. "Explain this." He jabbed a thick finger at the screen. "These access logs show someone entered the restricted archive at 0300 hours last Tuesday. Your employee ID..." Hazel looked at the screen, her expression unchanged. "That is not possible. The restricted archive requires dual authentication. My ID alone would not grant access." "Are you saying the system is wrong?" "I am saying the system shows what someone wanted it to show. If you check the secondary verification logs, you will find no biometric confirmation for that entry. Someone spoofed my credentials." Callahan's eyes narrowed. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not suspicion exactly, but something adjacent to it. How did a civilian librarian know about secondary verification logs? How did she understand the difference between credential spoofing and legitimate access? "And how exactly would you know that?" Hazel met his gaze steadily. "I read. It is literally my job." The answer was perfectly reasonable, perfectly unremarkable, and perfectly designed to shut down further inquiry. Callahan held her stare for a long moment, searching for something he could not quite name. Then he grunted and waved her away. "Get back to work, and stay where I can see you." As Hazel turned to leave, she allowed herself a small, private smile. The spoofed credentials were sloppy work. Amateur hour. Whoever was trying to frame her clearly did not understand that she had written the book on digital operational security. Literally. Though that book was classified at a level that would make most intelligence officers weep. The afternoon brought new challenges. Dr. Solomon Hartley arrived at 1400 hours, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses and the perpetually distracted air of someone whose mind operated on a different frequency than everyone else. He was the base's senior cryptography specialist, brought in to assess the security of classified communications protocols. "I need access to the technical reference section," he announced to no one in particular, wandering into the library like a lost professor searching for his lecture hall. Specifically, anything related to quantum-resistant encryption frameworks. Lieutenant Ivory Stanton, who happened to be nearby, laughed out loud. "Good luck with that. I doubt our bookworm even knows what encryption means." But Hazel was already moving. "Third row, second shelf from the top. We have the complete IEE proceedings on post-quantum cryptography, the known NIST standardization documents, and a technical monograph on lattice-based key exchange protocols. Would you like me to pull them for you?" The silence that followed was almost musical. Dr. Hartley's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. You know about lattice-based cryptography? I find the learning with errors problem particularly elegant, Hazel replied, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. Though I have always thought the Ring LWE variant offered better practical efficiency for real-world implementations. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in Ivory's eyes. The librarian had just made her look foolish, even if no one else fully understood how. Such things were not forgotten. Such things demanded retaliation. But Dr. Hartley was already following Hazel toward the technical section, bombarding her with questions about homomorphic encryption and zero-knowledge proofs. To his growing astonishment, she answered each one with the casual competence of someone who did not merely understand these concepts, but had practical experience implementing them. Remarkable, he murmured, almost to himself. Absolutely remarkable. Where did you study? Hazel shelved a misplaced volume without looking at it. Here and there, one picks things up. It was not an answer, and they both knew it. But Dr. Hartley had spent enough time in classified environments to recognize when someone was deflecting for a reason. He accepted the non-answer with a gracious nod and buried himself in the materials she had provided. The encounter did not go unnoticed. Chief Warrant Officer Otis Brennan, a Vietnam veteran with a face like cracked leather and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything, sat in a reading alcove pretending to study a manual on vehicle maintenance. He had been watching the librarian since he arrived that morning, drawn by something he could not quite articulate. Now, watching her discuss advanced cryptography with the same ease that most people discussed breakfast, the pieces began to fall into place. He had seen that kind of competence before. Seen it in the deep jungles of Vietnam, in the mountain passes of Afghanistan, in a dozen classified locations that did not officially exist. It was the competence of someone who had been trained to do impossible things and had succeeded often enough that impossibility became routine. Otis closed his manual and approached Raymond Oakes, who was lingering near the periodicals section with a pretense of reading a magazine that fooled no one. You see it too, Otis said quietly. It was not a question. Raymond nodded slowly. Kabul, 2004. There was a woman, a different name, same eyes. You sure? I am never sure of anything, but my gut has kept me alive for 38 years. I am not about to stop listening to it now. The two old soldiers exchanged a look that contained entire conversations. Whatever was happening in this library, whatever secrets that woman was carrying, they would wait and watch, because in their experience, the truth always revealed itself. You just had to be patient enough to see it. The afternoon sun slanted through the library windows, casting long shadows across the reading tables. The security sweep was winding down, having produced nothing but frustration and dead ends. Colonel Crawford had retreated to his office to make phone calls. Captain Mercer was pacing the main floor like a caged animal, his earlier confidence giving way to visible agitation. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to Sergeant Callahan. "We have been here all day and found nothing. The intelligence must be wrong, or we are looking in the wrong place," Callahan replied, his eyes drifting toward Hazel, who was quietly processing a stack of return materials at the circulation desk. "What, the librarian?" Mercer laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Come on, Brick. Look at her. She can barely walk without limping. You think she is some kind of secret agent?" "I do not think anything. I just notice things. And I have noticed that she knows more than she should about a lot of things that civilians do not usually know." Before Mercer could respond, the library doors burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Staff Sergeant Archer Delgado, the library's security officer, stumbled in, his face pale beneath his tan. "Captain, sir, you need to see this, now." The urgency in his voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. Mercer and Callahan exchanged glances before following Delgado toward the windows that faced the airfield. What they saw defied comprehension. 3 jets were approaching Fort Benning's runway. Not military aircraft, though they bore official markings. These were executive jets, sleek and powerful, painted in the distinctive blue and silver of Interpol's International Task Force. "What in the—" Mercer breathed. The base's alarm system chose that moment to come alive, filling the air with the distinctive wail of a general lockdown. The library's emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in harsh red. Colonel Crawford's voice crackled over the intercom. All personnel, this is not a drill. We are initiating lockdown protocols. Remain at your current locations until further notice. The library erupted into controlled chaos. Soldiers moved to secure exits. Civilian staff clustered near the center of the room, their faces reflecting confusion and fear. Through it all, Hazel Thornton remained at the circulation desk, calmly continuing to process returns as if 3 Interpol jets were not currently taxiing toward the main terminal. Clover Reyes appeared at her side, trembling slightly. "What is happening? Is it a terrorist attack?" Hazel glanced at the young woman, and for just a moment, something warm flickered in her gray eyes. "No. If it were an attack, there would be fighters, not executive jets. This is something else." "But what?" Hazel did not answer. She was watching the windows, where the jets had now come to a stop. Doors were opening. Figures in dark suits were emerging, moving with the coordinated precision of a well-trained team. 20 minutes. That was what she had estimated earlier. She had been exactly right. The architect was nothing if not precise. Lieutenant Colonel Caleb Winters was the first to reach the library, moving with the urgent stride of a man carrying news he did not fully understand. He was the base's liaison to international law enforcement, a role that usually involved paperwork and protocol rather than actual excitement. Today was not a usual day. "Colonel Crawford," he said, slightly out of breath as he approached the commanding officer who had just arrived. "Sir, we have a situation." "I can see that, Lieutenant Colonel. What the devil is Interpol doing on my base?" "They are asking for someone, sir. Someone they claim is essential to an ongoing international operation. They have executive authorization from the Director General himself." Crawford's face darkened. "Who are they asking for?" Winters swallowed hard, as if the words themselves were difficult to pronounce. "They are asking for someone called the Architect, sir. They say it is a matter of global security." The name meant nothing to Crawford. It meant nothing to anyone in the library, which had fallen into a tense silence as people strained to hear the conversation. It meant nothing to Captain Mercer, who had pushed his way forward with the aggressive posture of a man defending his territory. "The Architect," Mercer repeated. "Is that supposed to be a code name? We do not have anyone by that designation at Fort Benning. I would know." "That is what I told them, sir. They insist their intelligence is accurate. They have satellite confirmation, communication intercepts, the works. They are absolutely certain the Architect is here." The library doors opened again, and a new figure entered. Agent Director Hugo Kessler was not what anyone expected from the head of an Interpol task force. He was of medium height, with a slight paunch and thinning hair that he made no effort to conceal. His face was round and pleasant, the kind of face you might see on a university professor or a small-town accountant. But his eyes told a different story. Those eyes had seen the worst that humanity could offer and had learned to look back without blinking. "Gentlemen," he said, his German accent lending weight to the word, "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. The situation does not permit subtlety." Crawford stepped forward, every inch the commanding officer. "Agent Kessler, I presume, would you care to explain why you have turned my base upside down?" "Of course." Kessler's gaze swept the room, passing over faces with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "We are hunting a network. Hydra, they call themselves. Over the past 18 months, they have orchestrated attacks on 17 different nations. Chemical weapons in Prague, biological agents in Manila, coordinated cyber attacks that nearly collapsed the banking systems of 3 European countries." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "Last week, they announced their next target, the United States. The attack is planned for 72 hours from now. We do not know where. We do not know what form it will take. What we do know is that only one person has ever successfully penetrated Hydra's command structure. Only one person has the tactical brilliance and operational experience to help us stop them." "The Architect," Crawford said slowly. "Precisely. A legend in the intelligence community. The mind behind 17 successful counter-terrorism operations spanning 2 decades. The person who wrote the playbook that most Western intelligence agencies still use today." Kessler's voice carried something close to reverence. "We have confirmed beyond any doubt that the Architect is currently at Fort Benning. We are asking, politely but firmly, for your cooperation in locating them." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the room was wide. Every mind was racing through possibilities. Captain Mercer was the first to laugh. This is a joke, right? Some kind of training exercise? He turned to Colonel Crawford. Sir, I know every officer on this base, every enlisted person, every contractor. There is no one, and I mean no one, who fits that description. Interpol has been fed bad intelligence. A woman's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured. Perhaps you should check again. Agent Fern Castillo stepped forward from among the Interpol contingent. She was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of face that was beautiful in a severe, uncompromising way. Her eyes were fixed on a specific point in the room, on Hazel Thornton. You, Fern said, her voice catching slightly. It cannot be. You are supposed to be dead. Every head in the library swiveled toward the circulation desk, where the silver-haired librarian stood with a stack of books in her arms and an expression of mild curiosity on her face. Ivory Stanton burst out laughing. Her? The architect is supposed to be her? The woman who makes our coffee and files our paperwork? She turned to the Interpol agents with a look of theatrical disbelief. I mean, look at her. She can barely walk. She probably thinks Hydra is a comic book villain. The laughter spread through the gathered soldiers, nervous energy finding its release in mockery. Captain Mercer joined in, his voice rising above the others. Oh, this is too good. Tell me, Bookworm, which of your 17 successful counter-terrorism operations did you conduct from the fiction section? Was it between organizing the periodicals and dusting the encyclopedias? Hazel set down her stack of books with careful precision. Her face remained perfectly neutral, but those who were watching closely might have noticed something shift in her posture, something that had nothing to do with old age or physical limitation. I think, she said quietly, that you should stop talking now. Mercer's laughter died in his throat. Something in her voice had changed, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up without understanding why. But then the moment passed, and she was just a librarian again, harmless, ordinary, beneath notice. Agent Castillo, Hugo Kessler said, his voice cutting through the renewed laughter. What exactly do you mean by supposed to be dead? Fern had not taken her eyes off Hazel. Prague, 2009. I was a junior analyst at Interpol when we received intelligence about a planned chemical attack on the EU Parliament. The operation to stop it was led by someone we knew only as the architect. I was assigned to the support team. She paused, her throat working as if the memory was difficult to speak aloud. The mission succeeded. 18 terrorists neutralized, 3,000 lives saved, but the team leader was reported killed in an explosion during the extraction. Body never recovered. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I spent months studying that woman's tactical decisions. I wrote my graduate thesis on her operational methodology. I would know her anywhere. Ivory rolled her eyes. This is ridiculous. You are telling me that our coffee lady is some kind of legendary spy? Not a spy, Fern said. Something more. Something no one has ever successfully defined. The architect does not work for any single agency. She appears when she is needed, completes the impossible, and vanishes. We thought she was dead. Apparently, Hazel said mildly, reports of my death were somewhat exaggerated. The laughter stopped. No one was laughing now. The temperature in the library seemed to drop several degrees. Colonel Crawford stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled disbelief. Is this true? He demanded. Are you actually claiming to be this architect? Hazel tilted her head slightly, considering the question as if it were a mildly interesting academic problem. I am claiming nothing. Agent Castillo is making an observation. Whether that observation is accurate is another matter entirely. That is not an answer. No, Hazel agreed. It is not. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the security alert that suddenly blared from the base's communication system. Staff Sergeant Archer Delgado rushed to the nearest terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Sir, we have a breach in Sector 7. Someone is attempting to access the secure communication mainframe. Colonel Crawford's attention snapped to the immediate threat. Lock it down. All personnel, defensive positions. The library erupted into controlled chaos as soldiers moved to secure the perimeter. Hazel remained where she was, apparently forgotten in the shuffle, but her eyes were tracking everything, every movement, every position, every potential point of failure. When the man emerged from the archive room, she saw him before anyone else. Cassian Volkov was 43 years old, former Spetsnaz, current mercenary, and longtime operative for various organizations whose names changed frequently but whose intentions remained constant. He had infiltrated Fort Benning 6 months ago under the identity of a civilian IT contractor, patiently gathering intelligence and waiting for his moment. This was not the moment he had planned, but adapting to circumstances was what had kept him alive for 2 decades. He had a tactical knife in his hand and a USB drive in his pocket containing enough classified data to compromise American military operations for the next decade. What he did not have was a clear path to the exit. Clover Reyes was in his way. The young private had been moving toward the emergency exit when Volkov emerged. She froze, her eyes going wide as she registered the knife and the cold determination in his eyes. "Move," Volkov said in accented English, "or do not. It makes no difference to me." Clover could not move. Fear had locked her joints, frozen her vocal cords. She stood like a deer in headlights, watching death approach with the casual stride of someone who had done this many times before. Volkov raised the knife. And then Hazel Thornton was there. She moved like water, like wind, like something that should not have been possible for a woman who walked with a visible limp. One moment she was at the circulation desk. The next she was between Volkov and Clover, her body positioned in a stance that every special operations soldier in the room recognized instantly. Volkov's eyes widened. He had done his homework on Fort Benning. He knew every potential threat, every person of interest, every possible complication. The librarian had not even registered on his radar. That was his first mistake. He slashed with the knife, a professional strike aimed at the throat. Hazel caught his wrist, redirected his momentum, and applied pressure to a nerve cluster that sent white-hot agony shooting up his arm. The knife clattered to the floor. Volkov tried to counter, throwing an elbow toward her head. She was not there. She had already moved, flowing around his attack like smoke, her fingers finding another pressure point that dropped him to his knees. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds. 32 people watched in absolute silence as the silver-haired librarian held one of the world's most dangerous mercenaries in a submission hold that would require only a slight adjustment to become lethal. "The files on that drive," Hazel said, her voice still carrying that same mild conversational tone, "are protected by encryption that you have not broken. The access codes you think you obtained were planted 6 weeks ago. Every piece of intelligence you have collected has been deliberately fed to you." Volkov's face went pale. How could you?" "Because I designed the trap you walked into." Hazel applied slightly more pressure, drawing a gasp of pain. "Because I have been watching you since the day you arrived. Because I needed to know who you were reporting to, and now I do." She looked up at the gathered crowd, her gray eyes sweeping across faces that ranged from shock to disbelief to dawning comprehension. His handler is someone at this base, someone with high-level access, someone who has been feeding information to Hydra for the past 8 months. Her gaze settled on Fletcher Dunn, who had gone the color of old milk. "Arrest that man." 2 soldiers moved before anyone could countermand the order. Fletcher Dunn tried to run, made it exactly 3 steps, and found himself face down on the library carpet with his hands being secured behind his back. "This is insane," he screamed. "I did not do anything. She is lying. She is the one you should be arresting." Hugo Kessler walked slowly toward Hazel, his expression unreadable. "You knew about Volkov." "Yes." "You knew about Dunn." "Yes." "You knew we were coming." Hazel finally released Volkov, letting him slump to the floor, where soldiers quickly moved to secure him. She straightened, brushing a strand of silver hair back from her face with a gesture that seemed almost casual. "Agent Kessler, I have known about Hydra's resurgence for approximately 14 months. I have known about their planned attack on American soil for 3 weeks. And I have known that you would eventually find your way here since the moment you received that anonymous intelligence package in Vienna." The German's eyes widened. "That was you." "Of course it was me. Who else would know exactly what information to send, what channels to use, what buttons to push to get Interpol's most capable team deployed to precisely the right location at precisely the right time?" The silence that followed that was so profound that you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Captain Blaine Mercer was staring at Hazel, as if seeing her for the first time, which, in a sense, he was. The woman standing before him bore no resemblance to the meek librarian he had been tormenting for the past 6 months. Her posture had changed. Her presence had changed. The very air around her seemed charged with a different kind of energy. "This is impossible," he whispered. Hazel turned to face him, and for the first time she allowed the mask to slip completely. Gone was the invisible woman. Gone was the harmless civilian. In her place stood someone who had spent 20 years doing things that most people could not imagine. "Captain Mercer," she said, "you once told me to fetch Section Delta files. You said your grandmother could find them faster, and she had been dead for 15 years. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. I did not respond at the time because I was maintaining my cover, but since that cover is apparently no longer necessary... She took a step toward him, and he instinctively took a step back. "I have coordinated extractions in conditions that would make your worst nightmares look like a vacation. I have neutralized threats in 17 different countries across 4 continents. I have saved more lives than I can count, and taken more than I care to remember. And for the past 5 years, I have been working as a librarian in your base, watching, waiting, and protecting classified information that you did not even know existed." Another step forward, another step back. "So, when you told me to carry 50 pounds of documents up 3 flights of stairs, knowing that I walk with a limp, do you know what I was thinking?" Mercer shook his head, unable to speak. "I was thinking that I once carried a wounded teammate through 4 miles of hostile territory, with 3 broken ribs and a bullet in my shoulder. Your stairs did not even make my top 10,000 difficult days." The library had become a tableau of frozen figures. Soldiers who had laughed at Hazel's expense now could not meet her eyes. Ivory Stanton had pressed herself against the wall, her face a mask of horror, as she replayed every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual cruelty. Fletcher Dunn had stopped struggling, apparently having realized that his situation had just become significantly more complicated. Cassian Volkov, still on the floor, was looking at Hazel with an expression that might have been respect. Colonel Crawford was the first to break the silence. "I think," he said slowly, "that you need to start explaining, from the beginning." Hazel glanced at Hugo Kessler, who gave a slight nod. "The beginning." She moved toward the center of the room, her limp suddenly more pronounced. Not because she was tired, but because she was no longer trying to hide it. "Very well. My name, for those who want a name, is Hazel Thornton. That is the identity I have used for the past 5 years. But before that, I was known by many names, many designations, many code words." She paused, her gray eyes distant. 23 years ago, I was recruited by an organization that does not officially exist. My role was simple in concept and nearly impossible in execution. I was to be the architect, the one who designs operations that cannot fail, the one who sees patterns that others miss, the one who makes the impossible possible. 17 successful operations, Agent Castillo said softly. The Prague chemical attack, the Mumbai hostage crisis, the Beijing extraction, the Cairo network takedown. Every major counter-terrorism victory of the past 2 decades has your fingerprints somewhere in the background. Hazel nodded slowly. "Not all of them, but many, enough. Why?" The question came from Clover Reyes, who had finally found her voice. She was still pale, still shaking from her near-death experience, but there was something in her eyes that looked almost like wonder. "Why would you give all that up to become... this?" She gestured around the library, at the fluorescent lights and metal shelving and institutional carpet. Hazel's expression softened slightly. "Because I was tired. Because I had lost people I cared about. Because I needed to heal, and healing requires peace, and peace was something I had not known for a very long time." She touched her left leg, the one that caused her limp. 4 years ago, during an operation in Yemen, things went wrong. They sometimes do, no matter how good your planning is. I managed to complete the mission, but the cost was significant. 47 hostages freed, 12 terrorists neutralized, and 1 architect who would never walk properly again. The library was absolutely silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to have stopped buzzing. "I came to Fort Benning because this base houses one of the most comprehensive intelligence archives in the Western Hemisphere. Most of it is classified at levels that most people do not even know exist. I took the position of librarian because it gave me access to that archive while maintaining a perfect cover. An invisible woman doing an invisible job. You were protecting it," Raymond Oakes said, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "Not just using it, protecting it." "Yes." Hazel looked at him with something approaching warmth. Kabul, 2004. Sergeant, I remember you. You had a photograph of your daughter that you kept in your helmet. She would be grown now. Raymond's eyes glistened. She just made captain, Army intelligence. She has no idea about any of this. Good. That is as it should be. Hugo Kessler stepped forward, all business despite the emotional undertones swirling through the room. The architect, we need you. Hydra is planning something catastrophic, and we have less than 72 hours to stop it. Will you help us? Hazel was quiet for a long moment. Her gaze traveled around the library, taking in the faces of people who had dismissed her, mocked her, treated her as something less than human. Then her gaze settled on Clover Reyes, who was watching her with wide, wondering eyes. On one condition, Hazel finally said. Name it. Private Reyes has shown courage under pressure, loyalty to her colleagues, and the kind of instinctive moral compass that cannot be taught. Whatever comes next, she stays with me. Clover's mouth fell open. What? Me? But I did not do anything. I was just standing there. You were standing there, Hazel agreed. But when everyone else was looking away, when everyone else was finding reasons to ignore what was happening to me, you tried to help. Twice. 3 times. Small gestures that you probably thought did not matter. She walked toward the young woman, her limp pronounced but her bearing straight. In my world, those small gestures are everything. They are the difference between an operative who follows orders and a leader who inspires loyalty. They are the difference between someone who survives and someone who matters. Clover seemed unable to speak. Her eyes were filling with tears that she was too proud or too shocked to shed. There is something else, Hazel said, her voice dropping into something almost gentle. Something you do not know about yourself. Something that has been hidden from you for reasons that will become clear. She reached out and touched the young woman's wrist, just below the sleeve of her uniform. Clover flinched slightly, not from pain, but from the sudden intimacy of the gesture. We will talk later, Hazel said, when there is time, when there is privacy. For now, know this, you are not ordinary. You have never been ordinary. And before this is over, you will understand exactly what I mean. The moment hung in the air, pregnant with meaning that no one else in the room could fully grasp. Then Hazel straightened and turned to face Colonel Crawford with an expression that had nothing of the meek librarian left in it. Colonel, I believe you have some calls to make. The Joint Chiefs will want to be briefed. The Pentagon will need to authorize resources. And someone should probably contact Langley, though I suspect they already know I am here and have been waiting for this moment. Crawford stared at her for a long moment, processing the fundamental shift in their power dynamic. Then, slowly he nodded. Yes, ma'am. The honorific slipped out before he could stop it. Hazel smiled, the expression as brief as a summer lightning. Agent Kessler, I will need access to everything Interpol has on Hydra. Communications intercepts, financial tracking, asset networks, everything. You will have it within the hour. Dr. Hartley, I understand you are our cryptography specialist. I will need you to break something for me, something that has resisted the best efforts of several national intelligence agencies for the past 18 months. The slight man with the wire-rimmed glasses actually gulped. I will do my best. Your best had better be exceptional. The encryption in question is based on a variant of the Phantom Protocol. I should know. I designed it. The revelation hit Dr. Hartley like a physical blow. You wrote Phantom Protocol? That is the most sophisticated encryption framework in existence. There are doctoral dissertations devoted just to understanding its theoretical basis. I had a lot of time on my hands, Hazel said dryly. Now I need you to help me find its weakness. There is always a weakness. I should know. I built one in deliberately, just in case. The library was transforming before everyone's eyes. What had been a crime scene of sorts was becoming a command center. Hazel moved through the space with authority that seemed to bend reality around her, issuing orders that people rushed to obey. Tables were cleared and repurposed as workstations. Secure communication lines were established. The massive screens that usually displayed library information began showing tactical data feeds from Interpol databases. Through it all, Captain Blaine Mercer stood frozen near the entrance, watching the woman he had tormented for months orchestrate operations that most generals would struggle to comprehend. Ivory Stanton had retreated to a corner, her face a mask of barely contained terror. Her career flashed before her eyes, every snide comment and cruel joke replaying in merciless detail. The woman she had called Bookworm was coordinating international counter-terrorism efforts. The woman she had dismissed as incapable of knowing what encryption meant was apparently the author of encryption protocols that stumped the world's best cryptographers. There would be consequences. There were always consequences. But for now, watching Hazel Thornton command the room with the natural authority of someone who had been doing this since before most of them were born, all Ivory could do was wonder how she had missed it. How had anyone missed it? The answer, when it came, was both obvious and humbling. They had not missed it because Hazel had hidden herself particularly well. They had missed it because they had not bothered to look. They had seen what they expected to see, a middle-aged woman with a limp and a quiet demeanor, and they had never questioned that assumption. They had looked right at one of the most capable people on the planet and seen nothing. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all. As the hour grew late and the operation began to take shape, Hazel found herself standing at a window overlooking the airfield. The 3 Interpol jets sat on the tarmac like sleeping predators, their sleek forms illuminated by runway lights. Raymond Oakes approached, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered one to her without speaking. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Just Raymond now. I retired, technically. They bring me back for consulting work. Once a soldier, always a soldier. Something like that." He sipped his coffee, standing beside her in comfortable silence. "Kabul feels like a lifetime ago. Several lifetimes. The woman I saw that day, I never understood how someone could be that calm in that much chaos. Bullets flying everywhere, half our team down, exfil 30 minutes out, and you moved through it like you were taking a walk in the park." Hazel smiled faintly. "I was terrified. I have always been terrified. The trick is not eliminating fear. It is making friends with it, using it." "Is that something they teach?" "No. That is something you learn the hard way if you survive long enough." They stood in silence for another moment, watching the lights of the base twinkle in the gathering darkness. "The young private," Raymond said finally. "Reyes, what is she to you?" Hazel was quiet for so long that Raymond thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something he had never heard from her before: vulnerability. "Her mother was one of us. A different program, a different time, but the same purpose. She was killed during an operation in 2005. The details are classified, but what matters is that before she died, she asked me to watch over her daughter, to protect her until she was ready." "Ready for what?" Hazel turned to face him, her gray eyes holding depths that suddenly seemed fathomless. "Ready to learn who she really is. Ready to choose whether to follow in her mother's footsteps. Ready to understand that some legacies are written in blood and sacrifice and cannot be ignored." Raymond felt a chill run down his spine. "You are telling me that young woman is—" "I am telling you nothing, Raymond. Officially, unofficially. Watch her during the operation. See how she handles pressure. See what she becomes when the masks fall away." She turned back to the window, her reflection ghosting across the glass like a memory. "The architect does not work alone. Not anymore. I have spent 5 years watching, teaching, preparing, not just protecting the archives, not just waiting for Hydra to make its move, but cultivating." "Cultivating what?" Hazel's smile was thin and sharp and full of secrets. "The next generation." The night had transformed Fort Benning's military library into something that resembled a war room more than a repository of books. Screens glowed with tactical data. Communication equipment hummed with encrypted traffic from 3 continents. And at the center of it all stood Hazel Thornton, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, conducting operations with the practiced ease of someone who had done this more times than most people could count. The transformation in how people treated her was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had laughed at her expense now snapped to attention when she passed. Officers who had dismissed her as beneath notice now waited anxiously for her instructions. The shift was so complete, so absolute, that it created its own kind of dissonance in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Colonel Crawford had returned from his calls to Washington with an expression that suggested he had just received a significant education in things he had not known existed. He approached Hazel with a deference that would have been unthinkable mere hours ago. "Ma'am, I have confirmation from the Joint Chiefs. You have been given full operational authority for this mission. Whatever resources you need, whatever personnel you require, it is yours." Hazel nodded, without looking up from the tactical display she was studying. Thank you, Colonel. I will need satellite coverage of the northeastern seaboard, real-time traffic analysis of all major communication nodes, and access to the SYN-SA's pattern recognition algorithms. Already in progress? Good. I will also need Captain Mercer and Lieutenant Stanton to remain on base. They are not to leave until this operation is concluded. Crawford hesitated. May I ask why? Now Hazel did look up, her gray eyes holding something that might have been amusement or might have been something colder. Because they have spent the past 6 months demonstrating exactly how not to assess potential threats. They looked directly at me every day and saw nothing. That kind of blindness is dangerous in an intelligence environment. Before this is over, they will learn to see properly, or they will learn why failing to see can be fatal. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Crawford swallowed hard and nodded. Understood, ma'am. Across the room, Captain Blaine Mercer heard every word. His face had gone pale, then red, then settled into a sickly gray that matched the institutional carpet. The woman he had shoved, mocked, and tormented was now discussing his future with his commanding officer, as if he were a piece of equipment that needed recalibration. The worst part was that she was right. He had looked at her every day for 6 months and seen exactly what he expected to see. A middle-aged woman, a civilian, someone beneath his notice. He had never once considered that his assumptions might be wrong. Now those assumptions were crumbling around him like a building in an earthquake, and he had no idea what would be left when the shaking stopped. Lieutenant Ivory Stanton had retreated even further into her corner, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. She was running through every interaction she had ever had with the librarian, cataloging every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual cruelty, the coffee lady, the bookworm, the broken furniture that the administration had not gotten around to replacing. Those were the words she had used. Those were the words that other people had laughed at. And now those words were going to follow her for the rest of her career, assuming she had a career left when this was over. Hugo Kessler approached Hazel with a tablet displaying communication intercepts. We have new intelligence. Hydra's command structure is more distributed than we initially believed. There are at least 7 cells operating independently, each with its own target. Hazel studied the data, her eyes moving across the screen with the speed of someone who could process information faster than most computers. No, not independently. Look at the timing of their communications. They are synchronized. Someone is coordinating them, but the coordination is hidden in the noise. She tapped several points on the display, highlighting patterns that no one else had noticed. Here, and here, and here. These are not random. They are using a rotating cipher based on astronomical data, specifically the position of certain satellites at specific times. Dr. Solomon Hartley leaned in, his eyes widening behind his wire-rimmed glasses. That is remarkably elegant. The satellite positions would be publicly available data, but the specific combination would be nearly impossible to predict without knowing which satellites to track. Nearly impossible, Hazel agreed, but not actually impossible. My guide designed a similar system 15 years ago for a different purpose. The principles are the same. She turned to Kessler. I need access to the orbital tracking data for every commercial and government satellite in geostationary orbit over Europe and North America, and I need it cross-referenced with every communication we have intercepted from Hydra in the past 6 months. That is an enormous amount of data. Then we had better start now. The hours that followed were a masterclass in operational coordination. Hazel worked with a focus that seemed almost inhuman, pulling together threads of intelligence that had been floating in various databases for months, weaving them into a picture that gradually became clearer. Clover Reyes found herself assigned as Hazel's personal aide, a role that consisted mostly of fetching coffee, running messages, and watching in amazement as the older woman dismantled one of the most sophisticated terrorist networks in the world. How do you do it? Clover asked during a brief lull in activity. How do you see things that everyone else misses? Hazel paused in her work, considering the question. I do not see things that others miss. I see things that others choose not to see because seeing them would be uncomfortable. I do not understand. Consider your own experience here. You knew something was wrong with how I was being treated. You tried to help multiple times, but everyone around you was participating in the mockery, so you doubted your own instincts. You told yourself that you must be wrong, because how could everyone else be so mistaken? Clover nodded slowly. I thought maybe I was being too sensitive. You were being exactly sensitive enough. The others were not being sensitive at all. They saw what they expected to see, and they never questioned whether their expectations might be flawed. Hazel returned to her work, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Intelligence work is mostly about questioning expectations, about asking what if everything I believe is wrong. Most people find that question too frightening to ask. But you ask it. Every day, every hour, every minute. Hazel glanced at the young woman with something approaching warmth. It is exhausting, it is lonely, and it is absolutely necessary. The clock on the wall showed 0300 hours when the breakthrough came. Dr. Hartley let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a whoop, his professional demeanor cracking under the weight of discovery. I found it! The weakness in the cipher! You were right. There is a mathematical backdoor hidden in the 7th iteration of the key generation algorithm. Hazel was at his side in an instant, her limp apparently forgotten in her urgency. She studied the data on his screen, her eyes narrowing as she traced the implications. Yes, that is exactly what I built in. I never thought anyone would actually need to use it. You really did design this, did you not? The entire Phantom Protocol. I spent 3 years trying to understand its theoretical basis, and you just created it. I had help, and I had motivation. Her voice carried something that might have been regret. When you spend enough time in the shadows, you start to understand that every tool you create will eventually be used against you. So you build in safeguards, in escape routes, ways to turn your own weapons off if they fall into the wrong hands. She straightened, her expression hardening into something that reminded everyone in the room why they were here. Dr. Hartley, I need you to use this backdoor to decrypt every communication Hydra has sent in the past 72 hours. Agent Kessler, prepare your team for deployment. We now know where the attacks are planned, and we have less than 12 hours to stop them. The room erupted into controlled chaos as people rushed to fulfill their assignments. Hazel stood at the center of it all, calm and focused, the eye of a hurricane that was about to make landfall. Raymond Oakes approached her with a fresh cup of coffee. You knew this would happen. When you designed the protocol, you knew someone would eventually use it for something like this. I suspected. In this business, you learn to plan for the worst case. And building in a backdoor that only you could use. Hazel took the coffee, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Insurance, the kind that takes 15 years to pay off, apparently. What happens after this? After Hydra is stopped? She was quiet for a long moment, her gray eyes distant. That depends on many things. On how the operation goes. On what we find when we start pulling at threads. On choices that have not been made yet. That is not really an answer. No, Hazel agreed. It is not. The deployment briefing took place at 0500 hours, with the first rays of dawn beginning to paint the sky outside the library windows. Hazel stood before a room full of Interpol agents, military personnel, and intelligence officers, her small frame somehow commanding more attention than the generals who flanked her. Hydra has planned 7 simultaneous attacks across the eastern United States. The targets are infrastructure nodes, specifically the power grid substations that service major metropolitan areas. If they succeed, they will cause cascading blackouts affecting over 50 million people. The economic damage would be measured in billions. The human cost, in terms of hospitals losing power, traffic systems failing, emergency services being overwhelmed, would be incalculable. She gestured to the map displayed behind her, where 7 red dots pulsed ominously. We have identified the location of each cell. We have decoded their communication protocols. We know their timing, their methods, and their contingency plans. What we do not know is whether they have additional assets we have not detected. Agent Fern Castillo raised her hand. How do we proceed if there are unknown variables? We proceed with caution, overwhelming force, and the assumption that everything we think we know might be wrong. Hazel allowed herself a thin smile. Which is to say, we proceed exactly as we always have. The difference is that this time, we have a 12-hour head start instead of scrambling to catch up after the fact. The briefing continued for another hour, covering tactical approaches, communication protocols, and contingency plans for every scenario Hazel could imagine. When it finally concluded, The assembled personnel dispersed to their assignments with the focused energy of people who understood that failure was not an option. Colonel Crawford lingered as the room emptied. "Ma'am, I wanted to say, that is, I wanted to apologize for—" Hazel cut him off with a raised hand. "Colonel, you have nothing to apologize for. You treated me exactly as I wanted to be treated. Invisibility was my cover, and you helped maintain it by not looking too closely. But the others, Mercer, Stanton, the things they said, were cruel and unnecessary, yes, but they were also instructive. They showed me who in this base had character and who merely had rank." Her gaze drifted toward the corner, where Clover Reyes was organizing documents. "Some lessons can only be learned through observation." Crawford followed her gaze, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "You were testing us, all of us, this whole time. Not testing exactly, observing. There is a difference." Hazel turned back to face him. "Colonel, in my experience, the true measure of a person is not how they treat their superiors or their equals. It is how they treat those they perceive as beneath them, those they think cannot fight back, those they believe do not matter." She paused, letting the words settle. "You were dismissive of me, yes, but you were never cruel. You never went out of your way to make my life difficult. In the hierarchy of sins, that places you significantly above some of your subordinates." Crawford absorbed this with the expression of a man who was learning things about himself that he was not entirely comfortable knowing. "What will happen to them, Mercer and Stanton? That depends on them, on whether they can learn from this experience or whether their pride will prevent them from growing." Hazel's expression softened slightly. "I am not in the business of destroying careers, Colonel. I am in the business of saving lives. Sometimes that requires harsh lessons. Sometimes those lessons are harder for the students than they are for the teacher." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "But, for the record, Colonel, if either of them ever treats another person the way they treated me, I will know about it, and the consequences will be significantly more severe than a damaged ego." The morning sun was fully risen by the time Hazel found herself alone in a small office adjacent to the library. She had claimed it as a temporary command post, and now she sat in the worn leather chair, allowing herself a moment of stillness before the storm. Her leg ached. It always ached, a constant reminder of that night in Yemen when everything had gone wrong. 47 hostages freed, 12 terrorists neutralized, and one architect who had crawled through a collapsed building with a shattered tibia, refusing to stop until everyone was safe. The doctors had wanted to amputate. She had refused. 3 surgeries and 18 months of rehabilitation later, she could walk again, albeit with a limp that would never fully disappear. A small price, she had always told herself, for the lives that had been saved. But there were other costs that did not show on medical reports. The faces of the people she had lost over the years. The operations that had succeeded but felt like failures because someone had not come home. The weight of secrets that could never be shared. Decisions that could never be explained. Sacrifices that would never be acknowledged. 23 years. That was how long she had been doing this. 23 years of living in shadows, wearing masks, being someone other than herself. And now, in the span of a single day, all of it had been stripped away. She was exposed, visible, known. Part of her felt relief. The burden of secrecy was heavy, and setting it down, even partially, brought a lightness she had almost forgotten was possible. But another part of her felt fear. Not for herself, but for what came next. For the young woman with the dark hair and the brave heart who did not yet know what she was. For the organization she had spent 5 years building in the shadows. For the future she had been preparing for, without knowing if she would live to see it. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Clover Reyes stood in the doorway, hesitant but determined. "Ma'am, Agent Kessler said you wanted to see me." Hazel gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Clover. We need to talk." The young woman sat, her posture rigid with nervous energy. Up close, Hazel could see the resemblance more clearly. The shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw, the way she held herself when she was uncertain. Shoulders slightly raised, chin slightly tucked. So much like her mother. "You said there was something I did not know about myself," Clover said. "Something that has been hidden from me." "Yes. Is it about my mother?" Hazel felt something twist in her chest. Of course the girl had figured it out. She was her mother's daughter, after all. "Your mother's name was Elena Reyes. She was a field operative for a program that does not officially exist. She was brilliant, brave, and utterly dedicated to protecting people who would never know her name. Clover's hands were trembling slightly in her lap. She died when I was 3. A car accident, they told me. My grandmother raised me. It was not a car accident. Hazel's voice was gentle but firm. Your mother was killed during an operation in Colombia. She had infiltrated a cartel that was planning to smuggle chemical weapons into the United States. She succeeded in stopping them, but the extraction went wrong, and she did not make it out. Tears were streaming down Clover's face now, silent and steady. Why was I never told? Because the truth would have put you in danger. The cartel had long memories and deep pockets. If they had known that Elena had a daughter, they would have come for you. So, we created a different story. A car accident. A clean ending that left no loose threads. We? Hazel reached across the desk and took the young woman's hands in her own. I was your mother's handler, her mentor, her friend. When she knew she was not going to make it out of Colombia, she made me promise to watch over you, to protect you until you were ready. Ready for what? Ready to choose. Hazel squeezed her hands gently. Your mother never wanted this life for you. She wanted you to have a normal existence, free from the shadows and the secrets and the constant danger. But she also knew that sometimes the choice is not ours to make. Sometimes the world comes for us whether we want it to or not. Clover pulled her hands back, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Is that why you were at Fort Benning? To watch me? Partly. I was also here to protect the intelligence archives, as I said. But yes, being close to you was part of my mission. Watching you grow, seeing what kind of person you would become, waiting to see if you had inherited your mother's gifts. And have I? Hazel smiled, the expression carrying both pride and sorrow. You tried to help me when everyone else was looking away. You faced a man with a knife and did not run. You asked questions when others were content with easy answers. She paused. Yes, Clover, you have your mother's gifts. Whether you choose to use them is entirely up to you. The young woman was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had just learned. Her entire understanding of her own history was shifting, rearranging itself into a new pattern. The tattoo, she finally said, on my wrist. I have had it since I was a baby. My grandmother said it was a birthmark, but I always knew it was not. Hazel's expression flickered with something unreadable. Show me. Clover pushed back her sleeve, revealing a small mark on the inside of her wrist. It was subtle, easily mistaken for a birthmark or a scar, but to trained eyes, the pattern was unmistakable. A chess piece, a queen, surrounded by a circle of 13 stars, the same symbol that Hazel carried on her own shoulder. Your mother had one too, Hazel said softly. All of us do. It marks us as part of something larger, something that has existed, in one form or another, for longer than most people realize. What is it? A promise, a commitment, a reminder that some battles are too important to fight alone. Hazel stood, moving to the window where the morning light was streaming in. Your mother called it the sisterhood. Though that name is not quite accurate, there are men among us too. What we share is not gender but purpose. She turned to face Clover, her gray eyes holding depths that suddenly seemed ancient. For 23 years, I have been the architect, the one who designs, the one who plans. But I am not immortal, Clover. I am not indestructible. Someday, someone else will need to take my place. Understanding dawned on Clover's face. You want me to? I want nothing except for you to make your own choice, with full knowledge of what that choice means. If you decide to walk away, to live a normal life, I will support that decision. I will ensure that you are protected and that no one from our world ever troubles you. And if I decide to stay? Hazel's smile was thin and sharp and full of promise. Then your training begins today. The operation to neutralize Hydra unfolded over the next 8 hours with the precision of a Swiss watch. 7 teams, 7 targets, 7 synchronized strikes that dismantled the terrorist network before it could execute its planned attacks. Hazel coordinated everything from the library command center, her voice calm and steady, as she guided assets across 3 time zones. She anticipated problems before they materialized, adjusted tactics on the fly, and maintained situational awareness that seemed almost supernatural in its scope. By 1400 hours, it was over. All 7 cells had been neutralized. 43 terrorists were in custody. The planned attacks had been prevented before a single civilian was harmed. The cost had been minimal. 3 Interpol agents with minor injuries, 1 American soldier with a broken arm from a fall during the breach. No fatalities. It was, by any measure, a complete success. But Hazel knew better than to celebrate. Complete successes were rare in her world, and when they happened, they usually meant you had missed something. "The communications we intercepted," she said to Hugo Kessler, who was coordinating the post-operation cleanup. "Have your analysts finished reviewing them?" "Mostly. Why?" "There was a reference in one of the early intercepts. A code name I did not recognize. Phoenix." Kessler frowned, pulling up the relevant data on his tablet. "Yes, here it is. Mentioned 3 times in communications between the cell leaders. We assumed it was another code name for the overall operation. It was not." Hazel studied the intercepts, her eyes narrowing. "The context is wrong. They are not talking about Phoenix as if it were a plan. They are talking about it as if it were a person." "A person? You think there is an 8th cell we missed?" "No. I think there is something else entirely. Something we were not meant to find." She turned to Dr. Hartley. "Can you run those communications through the decryption algorithm again? Look for any patterns we might have missed the first time." The cryptographer nodded and bent to his work. 20 minutes later, he looked up with an expression that combined excitement and concern. "There is another layer, hidden beneath the primary encryption. It uses a completely different cipher, one I have never seen before." He paused. "Actually, that is not quite true. I have seen something similar, in theoretical papers about quantum-resistant post-encryption. But no one has actually implemented it. Someone has now." Hazel leaned over his shoulder, studying the patterns on the screen. "Can you break it?" "With time, possibly. But it would take weeks, maybe months." "We do not have months." The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Hazel straightened, her expression thoughtful. "Leave it for now. We have stopped the immediate threat, and that is what matters. Phoenix, whatever it is, can wait." But even as she said the words, something cold settled in her stomach. Phoenix was not just another operation. It was something else, something bigger. And whoever had designed that encryption knew exactly what they were doing. The architect had a new puzzle to solve, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not sure she would like the answer. The afternoon brought a different kind of challenge. With the immediate crisis resolved, the personal reckoning could no longer be postponed. Captain Blaine Mercer stood at attention in Colonel Crawford's office, his face a mask of rigid military discipline that could not quite hide the fear in his eyes. Hazel sat in the corner, observing but not participating, her presence alone enough to add weight to the proceedings. "Captain Mercer," Crawford began, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Over the past 6 months, you have engaged in a pattern of behavior toward a civilian employee that can only be described as harassment. You have used your rank to humiliate, intimidate, and demean someone who was in no position to defend herself. Sir, I am not finished." Crawford's voice cracked like a whip. "That this civilian employee turned out to be one of the most decorated intelligence operatives in American history does not change the nature of your actions. It merely highlights how catastrophically wrong your judgment has been." Mercer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "The question now is what to do about it. By rights, I should begin formal proceedings that would likely end your career. Your behavior violated multiple regulations regarding treatment of civilian personnel, and your failure to recognize a potential asset represents a fundamental failure of the observational skills expected of an officer." The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. "However," Crawford continued, "I have been advised that there may be value in a different approach, one that focuses on correction rather than punishment." Mercer's eyes flickered toward Hazel, who remained perfectly still in her corner. "Ma'am," Crawford said, addressing her directly, "you indicated that you had thoughts on this matter." Hazel rose from her chair and approached Mercer, stopping when she was close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead. "Captain Mercer, why did you treat me the way you did?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. I do not... Be honest, this is not a trap. I genuinely want to understand." Mercer swallowed hard. You were just a librarian, a civilian. You did not matter in the way that military personnel matter. You were there to support us, not the other way around. And that justified cruelty? I did not think of it as cruelty. I thought of it as maintaining proper order, proper hierarchy. Ah, Hazel nodded slowly. And where did you learn that proper hierarchy requires the degradation of those below you? The question hit Mercer like a physical blow. His composure cracked, and for a moment, something vulnerable showed through. "My father," he said quietly. He was a general, 3 stars. He always said that command required strength, and strength meant never showing weakness to subordinates, never letting them forget their place. And did that make him a good leader? Mercer was quiet for a long moment. "I thought so, when I was young, but the soldiers who served under him..." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "They feared him," Hazel finished, "but they did not respect him. And when things went wrong, when real crisis struck, they followed his orders because they had to, not because they believed in him." "Yes, that is not leadership, Captain. That is tyranny wearing a uniform." Hazel's voice was not unkind, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. True leaders inspire loyalty through trust, not through fear. They lift their people up instead of pushing them down. They understand that the measure of their strength is not how much power they can exercise over the weak, but how much they can empower others to become strong. She turned to face the window, her reflection ghosting across the glass. "I am giving you a choice, Captain Mercer. You can accept formal disciplinary proceedings, which will likely end your military career. Or you can accept a different kind of punishment, one that is, in many ways, much harder." "What kind of punishment?" "You will spend the next 6 months working directly under my supervision, not in a combat role, not in a command role. You will work as support staff, handling logistics, filing paperwork, making coffee for people who outrank you. You will experience firsthand what it feels like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be treated as less than human by people who do not bother to look closely." Mercer's face went pale. "That would be humiliating? Yes. Difficult? Absolutely. But at the end of those 6 months, you will understand something that your father never taught you. You will understand what it means to serve, not to command, not to control, but to serve." She turned back to face him, her gray eyes holding something that might have been compassion. "The choice is yours, Captain. Destruction or transformation. Which will it be?" The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, Mercer nodded. "Transformation," he said quietly. "I choose transformation." "Good," Hazel glanced at Crawford. "Colonel, I believe we have an understanding. I will expect Captain Mercer to report to my office at 0600 hours tomorrow." Crawford nodded, and Mercer was dismissed with a wave. As he left, his posture had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. Lieutenant Ivory Stanton's reckoning was different. She sat in the same chair Mercer had occupied, but her demeanor was entirely changed. Where Mercer had shown fear mixed with defiance, Ivory showed only defeat. "I know what I did," she said before anyone could speak. "I was cruel. I was petty. I took pleasure in making someone else feel small because it made me feel powerful." She laughed bitterly. "And look what that power turned out to be worth." Hazel studied her for a long moment. "Why did you do it?" "Because I could. Because everyone else was doing it. Because..." She hesitated, then continued in a voice barely above a whisper. "Because I was afraid. I am the only woman in my unit with my rank. Every day, I have to prove that I deserve to be here. Every day, someone questions whether I am really qualified or whether I just got promoted because of diversity quotas. I thought that if I was hard on others, especially other women, it would prove that I was not soft, that I belonged." "So you participated in cruelty to prove you were not weak?" "Yes." "And did it work?" Ivory's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face, smearing her mascara into dark tracks. "No. It just made me hate myself. Every time I said something cruel, I felt worse. But I could not stop. It was like a drug. The more I did it, the more I needed to do it." Hazel sighed, and for the first time, something like sympathy crossed her face. "Lieutenant Stanton, I'm going to tell you something that I suspect no one has ever told you. Your fear of being seen as weak is not unique. Every woman in a male-dominated field feels it. The difference is in how we respond to that fear." She leaned forward, her voice intense. "Some women respond by becoming harder than any man around them, by crushing anyone who might make them look soft by comparison, by building walls so high that no one can ever see the vulnerability inside. That is what I did. Yes, And it is a trap. Because the harder you become, the more isolated you feel. The more isolated you feel, the harder you have to become. It is a cycle that ends only in bitterness and loneliness. Ivory wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What is the alternative? The alternative is to be strong enough to be kind, to understand that true power does not require cruelty, to lead by example rather than by intimidation. Hazel smiled faintly. It is much harder than being cruel. It requires courage that most people do not have. Do I have it? I do not know. That is something you will have to discover for yourself. Hazel stood. Unlike Captain Mercer, I am not offering you a choice. Your actions did not stem from learned behavior that can be unlearned. They stemmed from fear, and fear can only be conquered by facing it. What does that mean? It means that you are being reassigned to a joint task force operating in a forward deployment zone. You will be working alongside soldiers from multiple nations, many of whom will question your competence, your qualifications, and your right to be there. You will have to prove yourself through performance, not through politics. Ivory's face went white. That sounds like punishment. It is. But it is also an opportunity. If you survive the experience with your integrity intact, you will emerge stronger than you ever imagined. If you revert to old patterns, if you try to build yourself up by tearing others down, you will fail. And in a forward deployment zone, failure has consequences far more severe than a damaged career. The lieutenant was silent for a long moment, processing her fate. Then, slowly, she nodded. I understand. Good. Dismissed. The rest of the afternoon was consumed by the endless administrative tasks that followed any major operation. Reports to be filed, debriefings to be conducted, prisoners to be processed and transferred to appropriate detention facilities. Through it all, Hazel worked with tireless efficiency. Handling each task with the same attention to detail she applied to tactical planning. The library staff, who had spent months watching her perform menial tasks, now watched her coordinate international law enforcement efforts with equal facility. By 1900 hours, the worst of it was over. The Hydra cells had been fully neutralized. The intelligence gathered from their communications was being analyzed by agencies across 3 continents, and Fort Benning was slowly returning to something approaching normal operations. Hazel found a quiet moment to step outside, breathing in the cool evening air. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the kind of sunset that made you believe, just for a moment, that the world was beautiful despite everything. Raymond Oakes joined her, his footsteps crunching on the gravel walkway. Quite a day. One of many. What happens now? To you, I mean. Your cover is blown. The whole world knows who you are. Hazel considered the question. The whole world knows one of my identities. There are others. You would just disappear after everything? Not disappear exactly. Transform. The architect was never meant to be a permanent role. It was always supposed to be passed on eventually to someone younger, someone who could carry the burden when I no longer could. The Reyes girl. Perhaps, if she chooses to accept it, if she proves capable. Hazel smiled faintly. Or perhaps someone else entirely. The future has a way of surprising us. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the colors fade from the sky. Then Raymond spoke again, his voice carrying something close to wonder. I have seen a lot of things in 38 years of service. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. But today what? Today I watched a librarian take down an international terrorist network from the reference section. I watched a woman who had been mocked and dismissed reveal herself to be one of the most capable people I have ever encountered. I watched cruelty meet consequence and arrogance meet humility. He shook his head slowly. If someone had told me yesterday that this would happen, I would have said they were insane. The world is stranger than most people realize, Hazel said, and the people in it are capable of far more than they are usually asked to demonstrate. Most go their entire lives without ever discovering what they could become if circumstances demanded it. Is that what happened to you? Circumstances demanded? Something like that. Her voice carried the weight of memories too heavy to share. A long time ago, someone saw something in me that I did not see in myself. They gave me an opportunity, a choice, a chance to become more than I was. I took it, and everything that followed grew from that single moment. Do you regret it? Hazel was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I regret specific decisions, specific failures, people I lost who might have been saved if I had been smarter, faster, better, but the path itself? She shook her head. No, the path was mine, and I walked it as well as I could. That is all anyone can do. The sun had fully set now, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere on the base, a bugle played taps, the mournful notes carrying across the evening air. I should get back, Hazel said. There is still work to be done. There is always work to be done. True. She paused at the door, looking back at the old soldier who had been one of the few to notice her when no one else was paying attention. Thank you, Raymond, for seeing. Thank you for being worth seeing. She smiled, and for a moment she looked almost young. Then the moment passed, and the architect vanished back into the library, back to the work that never ended, back to the shadows where she had always been most comfortable. The following morning brought a different kind of gathering. The library had been restored to its normal function, but a small group had assembled in the reading area near the windows. Hazel stood at the center, flanked by Hugo Kessler and General Priscilla Harding, who had arrived from the Pentagon overnight. The assembled personnel included Colonel Crawford, the remaining members of the Interpol task force, and a selection of soldiers and civilians who had been specifically invited. Among them were Clover Reyes, Raymond Oakes, Otis Brennan, Dr. Solomon Hartley, and, standing awkwardly in the back, Captain Blaine Mercer and Lieutenant Ivory Stanton. I wanted to thank everyone for their efforts over the past 24 hours, Hazel began. The threat has been neutralized, lives have been saved, and a message has been sent to those who would harm innocent people that we will not allow such attacks to succeed. She paused, her gray eyes sweeping across the assembled faces. But I also want to acknowledge that this operation revealed things beyond the immediate threat. It revealed strengths that had been hidden and weaknesses that had been ignored. It showed us who we are when the masks come off and the pretenses fall away. Her gaze settled briefly on Mercer and Stanton, who both dropped their eyes. Some of what was revealed was not flattering. Some of it was difficult to face. But that is the nature of truth. It is rarely comfortable, and it never conforms to our expectations. General Harding stepped forward. Ms. Thornton, on behalf of the Joint Chiefs and the intelligence community, I want to formally express our gratitude for your service. Not just for the past 24 hours, but for the past 23 years. Your contributions have saved countless lives and protected our nation from threats that most citizens will never know existed. Thank you, General. There is also the matter of your future. The President has asked me to extend an invitation. Whatever role you want, whatever resources you need, they are yours. You have earned the right to write your own ticket. Hazel smiled, the expression carrying something that might have been amusement. That is very generous, but I am afraid I must decline. A ripple of surprise passed through the gathering. Harding frowned. May I ask why? Because I have spent 23 years serving in ways that required me to be invisible. Now that I am visible, that approach no longer works. She turned to face the group, her voice carrying a new kind of authority. The architect was never meant to be a person. It was meant to be a role, a function, something that could be passed on when the time was right. And is the time right? I believe it is, or rather, I believe it will be soon. Her gaze found Clover Reyes, who was watching with wide eyes. The next generation is ready to step forward. They just need guidance, support, the chance to prove themselves that I was given so many years ago. Hugo Kessler cleared his throat. What about Hydra, the Phoenix reference? There are clearly elements of this network that we have not yet identified. There are, and those elements will need to be addressed, but not by me alone, not anymore. Hazel straightened, and something in her bearing shifted. The weariness that had lurked behind her eyes seemed to lift, replaced by something that looked almost like anticipation. I am not retiring. I am not disappearing, but I am changing my role, from architect to teacher, from operator to mentor. The skills I have accumulated over 2 decades need to be passed on before they are lost. She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Some of you may be wondering why you were specifically invited to this gathering. The answer is simple. Each of you has demonstrated something that caught my attention. Courage, integrity, the ability to see what others miss, the willingness to act when action is needed. Her voice dropped, becoming more intimate. I am building something new, a program that will train the next generation of operatives, not for any single agency, not for any single nation, but for the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. I am looking for people who want to be part of that." The silence that followed was profound. Then Raymond Oakes spoke. "Count me in." "And me," said Otis Brennan. "I would be honored," Dr. Hartley added. One by one, voices joined the chorus. Hugo Kessler, Fern Castillo, even Colonel Crawford, who admitted that he was probably too old for field work, but would be happy to provide administrative support. When the chorus subsided, Clover Reyes stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "What about me?" Hazel smiled, and the expression transformed her face. "What about you, Private Reyes? Are you ready to learn who you really are?" Clover took a deep breath. "I think I have been ready my whole life. I just did not know what I was waiting for. Then your training begins today." The gathering dispersed slowly, people drifting away in small groups, discussing what they had just witnessed and what it might mean for their futures. Hazel remained by the window, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Clover approached her, hesitant but determined. "There is something I need to know." "Yes?" "My mother. You said she died in Colombia, but the way you talk about her, the way you look at me sometimes." She paused, gathering courage. "Was there more between you? Were you more than just her handler?" Hazel was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a depth of emotion that few had ever heard from her. "Your mother was one of the finest people I have ever known. She was brave and brilliant and kind in ways that this world does not reward. And yes, she was more to me than just an asset or a colleague." She paused, her eyes glistening. "She was my friend, my closest friend. In a life defined by secrecy and isolation, she was the one person I could be honest with, the one person who knew me, truly knew me, and loved me anyway." "Did you love her?" "Yes. Not romantically, though others often assumed that, but deeply, fiercely, in the way that you love someone who has seen you at your worst and chosen to stand beside you anyway." Hazel turned to face Clover, her expression raw and open. "When she died, a part of me died with her, the part that believed I could have normal connections, normal relationships, a normal life. And watching over me, was that a way to keep her alive, in some sense? Partly, but also because she asked me to, because I made a promise, and because—" She hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "Because you reminded me that there are still things worth protecting, still people worth caring about, still reasons to continue when everything feels hopeless." Clover's eyes were wet with tears she was too proud to shed. "Thank you for telling me the truth. You deserve the truth, all of it, even the parts that are painful." They stood together in silence, two women connected by bonds of blood and choice and sacrifice. Then Hazel reached into her pocket and withdrew something small and metallic. "This belonged to your mother. She gave it to me the night before she died, asked me to keep it safe until you were ready to receive it." It was a ring, simple silver, unadorned except for a small engraving on the inside band. Clover took it with trembling fingers, tilting it to read the inscription. What does it say? It says, "The Queen protects the king, but she moves wherever she chooses." Clover laughed, a wet sound that was half sob. "That sounds like her, from what you have told me." It was her philosophy, her creed. She believed that true power was not about position or title, but about freedom of movement, about being able to go where you were needed, do what was necessary, without waiting for permission or seeking approval. And she passed that to me. She passed everything to you, her courage, her compassion, her gifts. Hazel placed a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder. "The only question is, what you will do with them." Clover slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I will make her proud," she said. "I will make both of you proud. I know you will." The preparations for departure began in the late afternoon. 3 Interpol jets sat on the tarmac, their engines warming for the flight back to Europe where the main investigation into Hydra's remnants would continue. Hazel stood near the lead aircraft, saying her goodbyes to Hugo Kessler and Fern Castillo. The German shook her hand with a grip that conveyed respect, bordering on reverence. "The architect returns," he said. "The intelligence community will be buzzing for months. Let them buzz. I have better things to do than worry about gossip." "What will you do, if I may ask?" Hazel glanced toward the library, where Clover Reyes was visible through the windows, helping to restore the facility to its normal operations. I will teach, I will prepare, and I will wait. Wait for what? For whatever comes next. She smiled, and the expression was full of secrets that would never be told. There is always something coming next, Agent Kessler. The trick is being ready for it. Fern Castillo embraced her, a gesture that would have seemed impossibly familiar 24 hours ago. Thank you, Fern whispered. For Prague, for everything after, for being the example I tried to follow. You followed it well. Your mother would be proud. Fern pulled back, confusion crossing her face. My mother? Hazel just smiled and said nothing more. Some revelations, she had learned, needed to unfold in their own time. The jets took off as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, climbing into a sky that was painted in shades of gold and crimson. Hazel watched them go, feeling the weight of another chapter closing. Then she turned and walked back toward the library, her limp more pronounced than usual after the exertions of the past day, but her steps were sure, her bearing straight, and her eyes held something that had not been there 24 hours ago. Hope. Inside the library, the restoration was nearly complete. Books had been returned to their proper shelves. Workstations had been cleared of tactical equipment. The only evidence of what had transpired was a slight rearrangement of the furniture and a new energy that seemed to vibrate in the air. Hazel paused at the circulation desk, running her fingers along the familiar surface. For 5 years, this had been her domain, her cover, her sanctuary. Now it would be something else. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She withdrew it, glancing at the screen. A single message, encrypted at levels that should have been impossible to penetrate. Phoenix has awakened, awaiting instructions. Hazel read the message twice, then deleted it. Her expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Something that spoke of knowledge too dangerous to share, and plans too complex to explain. She looked up to find Clover watching her, a question in the young woman's eyes. Is everything all right? Everything is changing, Hazel replied. Which is another way of saying everything is exactly as it should be. She pocketed the phone and crossed to where Clover was standing. The young woman had changed out of her uniform and into civilian clothes, looking somehow older and younger at the same time. There is something you need to know, Hazel said quietly. Something I have been preparing for without knowing if I would live to see it. What is it? Hazel reached out and took Clover's hands in her own, turning them so that the small tattoo on the young woman's wrist was visible. This mark that you carry. It is not just a symbol, it is a key to something that has been waiting for you since before you were born. A key to what? Hazel's smile was thin and sharp and full of secrets. To everything, my dear, to absolutely everything. The library doors opened and Raymond Oakes entered, his expression urgent. We just received word from Washington. There is a situation developing. They are asking for you. Hazel nodded, unsurprised. Of course they are. There is always another situation. She released Clover's hands and straightened her shoulders, preparing to face whatever came next. But before she walked away, she leaned in close and whispered something that only the young woman could hear. Your mother did not die in Colombia. Not completely. Part of her survives. Part of her has been waiting. And when you are ready, truly ready, I will take you to her. Clover's face went pale. What? What does that mean? But Hazel was already moving, already slipping back into the role she had played for so long. The invisible woman, the architect of impossible operations, the ghost who moved through the shadows and left miracles in her wake. At the door, she paused and looked back. Her gray eyes met Clover's across the length of the library, and in that gaze was a promise and a warning, and a love as deep as anything the young woman had ever known. The architect never retires, Hazel said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet space. We just change shifts. Then she was gone, disappearing into the Georgia evening, leaving behind more questions than answers and a future that shimmered with possibility. Clover stood alone in the library, the ring on her finger catching the last light of the dying sun. Outside, the world continued its endless turning. Soldiers trained, officers commanded, lives unfolded in patterns both ordinary and extraordinary. But here, in this place where books held secrets and librarians carried the weight of nations, something new was beginning, something that would change everything. The Queen protects the King, the inscription read, but she moves wherever she chooses. Clover smiled. And in that smile was an echo of her mother, an echo of Hazel, an echo of all the women who had come before and all who would come after. The architect's legacy was just beginning, and she would be worthy of it. This story reminds us of a truth we often forget. The most powerful people are rarely the loudest in the room. Hazel Thornton spent 5 years being invisible, enduring mockery and disrespect, not because she lacked the ability to fight back, but because she understood something profound. True strength does not need to announce itself. It simply exists, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment when it truly matters. The first lesson is simple yet devastating. Never judge a person by their appearance, their job title, or the way they walk. The woman serving your coffee might have saved more lives than you will ever know. The janitor cleaning your office might carry secrets that would shake governments. Every person you meet is living a story you cannot see. The second lesson cuts deeper. Cruelty is never justified by hierarchy. Captain Mercer and Lieutenant Stanton believed their ranks gave them permission to demean those beneath them. They were wrong. Leadership built on fear creates only resentment. Leadership built on respect creates loyalty that lasts forever. The third lesson is perhaps the most important. Kindness in small moments reveals character more than grand gestures ever could. Clover Reyes tried to help when everyone else looked away. That single choice changed her entire destiny. So, ask yourself today, how do you treat the people you think cannot fight back? How do you speak to those you believe do not matter? Because someone is always watching, and sometimes that someone is exactly the person you underestimated. Subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because respect costs nothing, but disrespect can cost everything.